There are certain things we really want to emphasize, and I know she hit on some of this, of making sure people have an idea about the scale of what we're talking about in terms of things qualifying for a mental disorder. For example, with phobias, a person can be afraid of something and be really bothered by something without qualifying for a clinical diagnosis of phobia. I don't like heights, but I don't avoid them. I'm not, going up the escalator, just terrified of what's going to happen. I don't like it. Um, but that's not a phobia, even though it bothers me. I was talking to a friend of mine about this once. He said he had a fear of heights that would be severe enough to call a phobia. I said, well, most people who say they have phobias don't actually. But he said, no, one time he was in a glass elevator, it's going up, and a friend who knew he was bothered by heights shoves him up against the glass. And when the friend steps away, the guy I know, Kerry, drops to the floor in a fetal heap. And when the elevator doors open, he crawls out. And I said, yeah, okay, that does sound like it qualifies possibly for a phobia. That's true. One particular issue I want to get into is PTSD. I know Rebecca talked about it at length. And then a modern PTSD diagnosis that she did not get into, but that has become increasingly common for therapists to apply the diagnosis. Going through the specific criteria for it, these are the DSM criteria. And if you've picked up the DSM abbreviated manual, then you will be able to look and see at a glance what the criteria are, what it takes to qualify for PTSD as an example of one of the many disorders in there. That book is a nice, handy way to look and see what is the difference between this disorder and another one. Our first test was about background material. From now on, the tests are about understanding the disorders. The most important thing for you to know from now on all the tests is what is each disorder. What makes somebody qualify for that disorder? What's the difference between one disorder and another? Those are the things you need to focus on. Going through your book, reading the chapter summaries is one of the best ways to review material. You look through, anything. I'm going to have questions. What did you learn from the book that wasn't on this test? I will have a diagnostic example at the end of each test, and then the final is half diagnoses for you to select a diagnosis that you think fits somebody, and then demonstrate why you think that diagnosis fits, and rule some things out. For example, if you were to talk about obsessive-compulsive disorder, the anxiety disorder, and you read a description, you think that is what fits the person best, then you would say your preferred diagnosis is obsessive-compulsive disorder, and you need to specify, and it's unusual with this one, you might say in parentheses, the anxiety disorder, or call it obsessive compulsive anxiety disorder, which is one case where we'll excuse you not having the exact name because there is a similarly named disorder in the personality disorders, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Well, you haven't studied that one yet. Let's say it's the other way around when you're doing the personality disorders for the next test. And you see somebody and you think this person has obsessive compulsive personality disorders. Well, one obvious rule out is OCD, the anxiety disorder. So you prefer diagnosis, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and then for something to rule out, obsessive compulsive anxiety disorder. And depending on what symptoms are presented, maybe you read about the person's fears and worries. You think, okay, there's a germ phobia. That might be a good one to rule out. Or you might want to have in your notes and your explanation of it to say, this person also has the germ phobia, but their primary diagnosis is the obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So that is something you're going to be doing once on each test, and that is very important preparation for the final. On these criteria that we have listed here for PTSD, first criterion is that the person has a trauma. The stressor, the previous editions of the DSM required it to be a trauma directly happening to you personally in which you felt your life was threatened. They've expanded a bit because we have found that some people can effectively be traumatized, indirectly. Somebody in your family nearly gets killed, or is an incident that gets them killed. That could be traumatizing. And then people overuse the word traumatizing, though. Something can upset you. Something can upset you deeply and long lasting without it being a trauma. We tend to be talking about something life threatening, something that severe for us to call it trauma. An example here on indirect exposure, first responders, they're not there when the traumatic event happens. They're there during the aftermath. They're repeatedly exposed to these things. And that'll also figure into the complex PTSD later on. But there's some who they may have been able to deal with it many times. And then there's one case in particular that just hits them hard. And that is the one that, for them personally, is the traumatic event. Intrusion symptoms. The person has to show one of these. The traumatic event is persistently relived, even as they're avoiding thinking about some things, but they're reliving it somehow through intrusive memories. Not just that they remember it more than other people, but the memories pop into their heads at times when they're intruding on other things. They're getting in the way of other things they need to do. It could be nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress or physical distress after exposed to reminders of these things. I know you don't all know the same real world examples. You don't even know all the same fictional examples. But, if you ever watch a movie or TV show and somebody's avoiding a location that reminds them of where they had a trauma, that's, if they're feeling the physical distress when they do encounter it, that is the kind of reliving experience that it's talking about here. It could be an item that triggers them. It could be a specific thing someone has. I knew with a therapist who had a client who, it was a specific type of person that the sight of them would keep reminding them of this thing that had happened to them once upon a time. And that was a problem because it's starting to intrude and interfere with other things in life when randomly a specific physical type on a person is going to make you relive some past trauma. That is an intrusion symptom. Then there's the avoidance system. In addition to reliving it, they're somehow avoiding the things. You could have some symptoms of PTSD. You could have many of them. You could relive a traumatic event. You could have somebody who goes into crisis management, somebody who becomes a first responder because of something traumatic that happened to them once upon a time. They are not avoiding the reminders. They're seeking them out when they choose to follow that path. So if they're avoiding thinking about the things that reminded them, if they're the one who was avoiding that location, you can have some avoidance without it interfering with other things. Like when I mentioned phobias earlier, I knew somebody who was arachnophobic. One phobia word you all probably know, they're afraid of spiders. And this individual, who was actually a graduate student in the psychology program, not clinical, but she was terrified of spiders. She turned down a free trip to Texas because her uncle had told her that there were spiders all over the place, spiders the size of puppies. And this avoidance interfered with something she needed to do. Then there was an occasion when she could not get out of going to Texas and she didn't see a spider the entire trip. And then, she was okay with the idea of Texas, despite her uncle having created that association. Yeah, that was a strong avoidance symptom. So we're talking about how severely is the person avoiding? Is it interfering with other things that they need to do? Negative alterations in cognitions, in how you think, and mood. So 2 of these symptoms, just 2 from this whole list. They have negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsened after the trauma. And that is something you really have to get into. You're talking to somebody who's very fearful about a trauma. Don't assume that their fearfulness is all caused by the trauma. What if they were a fearful person before? What if this is somebody who already had nightmares? Okay, just having nightmares right now does not necessarily qualify them for PTSD if they're not nightmares that were caused by the PTSD. Maybe they can't recall key features of the trauma. That's a tricky thing to talk about, though. There's a phenomenon called weapon focus, where somebody's attention to a weapon being used against them devotes so much of their thought process and their emotional reaction that they don't remember as much about the rest of what happened. Okay, that's normal. That's not what this is talking about. That weapon focus can, keep them from recognizing the face of the person who held the weapon on them. Especially if they're holding a weapon on you, you may be trying not to look them in the eye, unless you're one who is going to determinedly stand up. That raises the odds you get shot. And maybe there are important things about it. If you go through this trauma and you can't remember if they had a weapon on you or not, okay, that's really unusual to not remember that key feature. Overly negative thoughts or assumptions about yourself or the world, a strong sense of self-blame or others for causing the trauma. That sense of blaming yourself, it doesn't have to be realistic. A child an 8-year-old who sees his parents killed by a mugger has absolutely no reason to blame himself for the parents getting killed by that mugger. He may engage in fantasies of, oh, what if I'd leapt at the mugger's knee? Or what if I hadn't wanted to go to the movies that day? It doesn't matter. It's like that's a normal thing. There's no reason not to have wanted to go to the movies. There's nothing realistic involved in that child blaming himself for what happened. But it does happen. You can't necessarily be realistic when your emotions are forming, especially at an early age like that. Although kids are actually more resilient than adults tend to be with trauma. Some people misunderstand and think that means they're not going to be affected. Some are affected more severely, but kids tend to adapt to trauma more easily than adults do. The world is already a scary, chaotic, confusing place, and they're trying to figure it out when they're kids. It's when you're an adult and you think you have some things figured out and you've learned some patterns that a severe change to it can traumatize you more. Negative affect. Affect is not affect like the verb. Affect is a word referring to emotional expression. And your feelings themselves. So negative feelings, especially in how you express them. Decreased interest in activities, the person who is no longer interested in activities that they were interested in before. So if you see somebody who you think might have PTSD and they're avoiding social situations, you got to find out, were they avoiding social situations before? Maybe they are avoiding them now. Maybe they're not. But avoidance and then lack of interest, you also have to figure that out, because avoiding it, that's an avoidance system. No longer feeling motivated to go do the things they would be interested in. And just is like, no, I just don't feel like going and doing it. That's not avoiding it. That's not bringing themselves up to that in the first place. There's a difference between not wanting to do something and dreading it. There's a difference between not going out and avoiding going out. Feeling isolated, difficulty experiencing positive affect. This is a different symptom from negative affect. You can have both positive and negative affect. You can have a lot of happiness and a lot of anger, a lot of sadness. You can be alternating between the two. That's another thing about these chapters currently. Don't assume a mood swing means bipolar disorder. Bipolar is a specific kind of cycle, specific kind of pattern they go through. You could have both positive and negative affect in the same person. You can have mood swings for reasons other than bipolar disorder, and it could be a post-traumatic reaction. But one of the possibilities from this group is that they're having difficulty feeling happiness. Whereas they don't have to have the entire set on any of these. Remember, the previous one had said they had to have two. And this one is that they have to have two. That's the previous one. Alterations in arousal and reactivity, irritability or aggression, crankier, more physically aggressive. Don't mistake the word aggression for assertive. Assertive is, when you refer to an aggressive salesperson, you probably mean assertive, not aggressive. Aggressive is more directed at hurting others, maybe physically, maybe verbally, attacking them emotionally. A risky or destructive behavior, including self-destructive behavior. Hypervigilance, got to be careful with this word. Hypervigilance, extreme vigilance, too much vigilance, too alert to the possibility of danger. So say the person who's experienced with trauma inspired them to go into an occupation where they would encounter a lot of trauma. Maybe the person becomes a firefighter as a way of helping people. Well, it's normal to be more vigilant, more alert to danger than average in that occupation. You're an undercover police officer. You'd better be extremely alert to the possibility of danger. So we're looking at when the person is too extremely alert to the possibility of danger, so much so that those concerns are making them excessively suspicious, excessively wary. It can interfere with the ability to trust others when they should. Heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. Again, you got to look, how well did they concentrate before? How well did they sleep before? Symptoms last for more than 1 month. An interesting thing about PTSD is that you don't tend to see them as much in the first month after. The person with PTSD does not tend to show the worst post-traumatic reactions during the month after. They're not letting themselves process it. They're not letting themselves feel the hurt, the worry, the pain as much as other people. So they haven't started to work on it, and they let it build in them more. And then when the symptoms do start, they last for more than a month to qualify for this. Otherwise, it might be something like acute stress disorder. Functional significance, and I've been referring to this earlier, they've got to cause some distress and impairment in their lives. And it can be any aspect of life, occupational, educational, social. And the symptoms are not because a medication has made them feel bad, substances that they're on, other illness. They've got these distinctions here. One of the things I really want to talk about today is complex PTSD. It is not currently in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but it has become an increasingly frequent diagnosis administered by professionals. It is in the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization. Most of the disorders as outlined in the ICD line up with the DSM. Clinicians in America, a lot of them for their software purposes, for insurance purposes, they have to code the mental illnesses according to the ICD rather than the DSM. Complex PTSD, okay, obviously, like the name says, it's complex, but what is complex? It tends to be the trauma itself and their reaction to the trauma. The person who has one traumatic event, that's different from the person who has repeatedly have traumatic events happen in their lives. The combat soldier who's gone through a lot of combat, who has seen many people die, who has had many experiences coming close to death, has kept having trauma and kept having trauma and kept having trauma. And the reactions tend to be different. They probably numb themselves a lot to survive, escaped. If they got through that, and they may have had a complete breakdown. So it's how often have the traumas happened? How long has a trauma happened? It's like, how long did this go on? You're trapped and think you might suffocate to death for hours. That is going to be different from you're trapped for days before you're rescued. The one who it lasted longer may experience the phenomenon more severely. They've had a lot more time for it getting ingrained in their head, even intruding their sleep. And how severe is the trauma itself? Some key differences between PTSD and complex PTSD is, of course, the traumatic event itself. There are also some differences in how people react. A lot of complex PTSD had to do with repeated trauma in childhood. It's or long-lasting trauma that went on for months or years. The person who's showing complex PTSD, a difference in their symptoms, they tend to show more trouble controlling their own emotions, greater detachment from other people. That was probably part of what was involved in them surviving what they went through. If they were being victimized by somebody, being detached from other people around them, it's hard to be attached to your victimizer. So that'll happen as well as a different kind of survival mechanism. But there can be this emotional detachment from, but maybe because of the victimizer or from all these other people who weren't helping or who didn't know who they were. They were afraid to get close to people because they were terrified of other people finding out what they were going through. The soldier going through combat, repeatedly seeing, brothers in arms die. You get less attached to them along the way, maybe as a survival mechanism. It affects how they see themselves. They'll have more negative self-perception, worse view of themselves, greater difficulty in their relationships. The distorted perceptions of the perpetrator. That's what I was saying. You may actually have a way of trying to rationalize the way the victimizer is acting toward you as a way to survive being around them. You may stop learning to recognize what they're doing to you to feel better about yourself or to reduce the degree to which the stress is crushing you. A loss of a system of meaning, so maybe they lose faith, hope, core values, and beliefs. Somebody who's been held captive. Let's go to an extreme example. Their captor has tried everything they can to crush that person's spirit, to kill their hope, to teach them that nobody will ever help. You don't have to have a victimizer. You don't have to have a perpetrator. You can have long-term trauma for other reasons. You got a frequent trauma. Maybe you've lived in a place that has repeatedly had natural disasters. More often than not, though, complex PTSD has some victimizer or victimizers. But it could be other things. I had a soldier come up to me at a convention, and he saw what one of my books was in that open dialogue. And he told me that Yoda saved his life. He was explaining this to me. He'd been in combat, and he was the only one from his group to come home alive. So we're talking about severe events, very severe what happened, a lot of trauma involved there, and he was having trouble regulating his emotions. He was suicidal. He would have some degrees of detachment. He had trouble connecting with others, trouble opening up because nobody could understand what he'd gone through around him. And one of the things, unfortunately, for a lot of PTSD sufferers is that people in their lives don't necessarily show enough patience or get tired of their PTSD. So when they wish they'd get over it already, and that doesn't help them. He was having difficulty in his relationships, and he was having trouble finding meaning. And there was one particular comment. It was something he latched onto. He was when he was in a suicidal state. There was this line from the character Yoda, yes, the character in the Star Wars movies, that was inspiring to him, and he held on to that. That became like when somebody going through Alcoholics Anonymous hangs on to their sobriety chip as a way to focus and help them avoid taking a drink. For him, that line from Yoda became his chip, his thing to hold on to help him move away from the suicidal thoughts. I've met a lot of people who've told me things like that helping them. It could be something very real, something in real life. It could be an item. It could be a thought. I know someone, he wrote a book about this, a graphic novel about this, a guy who, when he was a kid, was molested, and later on he formed suicidal thoughts because he'd heard on TV someone say that the molesters were molested, and to this kid he interpreted it as them saying he was going to become a monster because he had been molested. He did not want to do that to anybody else. He formed a suicide plan, and what helped him break that chain of thought was thinking, what would Batman say? And he mentally hearing Batman reassure him everything will be all right. For him, that became the thing he held on to help him move past. Absolutely never completely got over it all. Getting over it is different from saying a person has learned to manage things, that they've gotten past the worst of their pain. It could be that they've learned to manage their pain. They've learned to find ways to maybe even do something useful with it. Like when he told his story, it became useful for him talking about it. And he's heard from so many other people that him telling his story helped them. There are different kinds of treatment depending on the symptoms. Different approaches to therapy can be helpful with different aspects of complex PTSD. Focusing heavily on the trauma itself, getting the client to talk about the trauma repeatedly may just make it worse. You need to look at the symptoms. What are the symptoms they're feeling? The distress itself. There are techniques for helping them deal with the stress. There are methods to deal with how you think about what's specific stimuli, specific events. So a lot of the treatment that is more effective tends to focus more on the symptoms than the trauma. There are trauma-based therapists who they have specific techniques of dealing with that, but they're trained in how to work with them about the trauma without making it worse. Again, people vary in how they manifest these things. You remember, one symptom from this group, two from that group, one from this group. You end up with a combination. Like when you hear Taco Bell say they've got 70,000 combinations of what their items can become with the same small number of ingredients, you can have more different manifestations of PTSD or complex PTSD. Nobody follows a cookbook when developing a mental illness. Nobody follows a specific guideline. Oh, I'm supposed to have, one here and two there. So it could be a lot more than that. It could be manifesting differently, or it could be manifesting in a way that does not quite meet full criteria for PTSD, but still is something worth looking at, something worth trying to improve on. All right. Questions, comments, insults. Camera view of somebody's ceiling, apparently.